system amid the weaponization of trade and rising geopolitical tensions. Allow me to begin by giving us some brief context, but also introducing the panelists for our panel today. And I would like to start with introducing myself. My name is Herbert Kafero. I work with Southern and Eastern Africa Trade Information and Negotiations Institute, CIATINI. And together with South Center, we have organized this webinar on Trade is War, reassessing the global trading system amid the weaponization of trade and rising geopolitical tensions. This webinar is organized at a time when there are really global dynamics that have far-reaching implications on Africa and developing countries in general. But for purposes of deepening the conversation, we will focus mainly on the African continent. And the various experts that we have today will be sharing around the position of Africa now amidst these global dynamics and propose Afrocentric alternatives and proposals towards salvaging the situation. I would like to straight away go to the introduction of the panelists that we have today. The first panelist that I would like to introduce is Ms. Jane Nalunga. Ms. Jane Nalunga is the Executive Director of Southern and Eastern Africa Trade Information and Negotiations Institute, CIATINI. I would like to share a bit about her profile. She's an expert on trade, fiscal, and investment-related issues. She has vast experience and expertise in analyzing national, regional, and international trade, investment, fiscal, and related agreements and policies, and how they interact with key development dimensions such as climate change, gender, human rights, and food security. She has more than 20 years of experience in policy research, analysis, and advocacy, and has authored a number of policy-oriented studies and articles. She has substantial experience advising governments, civil society organizations, private sector, and policymakers on trade and a broad range of development-related issues. And of course, she's the executive director of CIATINI. I earlier shared that. And the second panelist is Mr. Edgar Odari, who is the executive director at Econews Africa. He previously worked as program coordinator at Econews before taking this position. He's a lawyer specializing in trade, investment, and extractives. He's also the co-chair and technical advisor to the Haki Madini Kenya Coalition, a civil society network in the mining sector. He previously worked for the Trade BSC Consulting, a trade and investment consulting group, as well as the Southern and Eastern Africa Trade Information and Negotiations Institute, CIATINI in its Kenyan office. He has previously consulted independently for several institutions, including the Institute of Economic Affairs, the Norwegian Church Aid, the Kenyan Human Rights Commission, Diaconia Kenya, Tata Chemicals. He also holds a Bachelor of Laws degree from Moi University. He was part of the 2015 cohort of emerging leaders in African mining. And his CV is long, it goes on and on, but for the purposes of the introduction, I'll keep it at that. The third panelist is Comrade Rangrilai Machemes, who is the coordinator for CIATINI Southern Africa with over 25 years of experience in regional and multilateral trade issues. He has written and also peer-reviewed various papers on trade and health, book chapters, journal papers, and published articles. He's a Chevening scholar who holds an MA in globalization and governance from the University of Hull. The fourth panelist and the last is Ms. Vahini Naidu, who is the program coordinator, Trade for Development at South Center, Geneva. Ms. Vahini Naidu is the program coordinator at South Center, an intergovernmental organization that supports developing countries in advancing their common interests in global policy spaces. She is an experienced lawyer, trade negotiator, and former diplomat. Vahini provides legal and policy advice to developing countries and their groupings on international trade negotiations and strategies, both in Geneva and in the respective capitals, all the respective national levels. Vahini was an international trade negotiator with South Africa's Department of Trade and Industry, covering negotiations under SADC, the Tripartite Free Trade Area, the CFTA, and the WTO. She also served as a diplomat at South African Permanent Mission to the WTO in Geneva, where she was the focal point and coordinator of the African group in the WTO. So today we are glad to have four experts join us to dissect the global dynamics and their implications on Africa, but also share some Afrocentric alternatives and proposals towards salvaging the situation. They will put in context a number of issues, and each of the speakers will be sharing with us for the first 7 minutes, and then we will engage the rest of the experts and stakeholders that have joined us today. But I would like to start with Ms. Jane Nalunga, who is the Executive Director of CIATINI. She will start with the opening remarks and also delve deep into the specific areas that we would like her to elucidate on, but also put in context quite a number of issues. And for purposes of guiding the discussion, I would like to engage Ms. Jane Nalunga to specifically share with us around the unilateral trade measures, tariffs, and sanctions, all conditionalities imposed by developed countries, and how they undermine Africa's right to development and the ability to craft trade and industrial policies. And she will continue to also share with us around specific counter strategies that can be developed at the continental level through the African Continental Free Trade Area and regional economic communities, the RECs, to reclaim and institutionalize Africa's policy space. Over to you, Ms. Jane Nalunga.
Thank you so much, Herbert, for that kind introduction. And good morning, good evening, the participants in this webinar, wherever you are. We are very happy to have you. Just to point out that we are organizing this webinar together with South Center, CIATINI and South Center. So why this webinar? This is a high-level dialogue where we have convened it to interrogate the shifting global trade architecture, characterized by heightened geopolitical tensions, protectionist industrial policies, and a breakdown of multilateralism. The objective of this webinar is to craft strategic and forward-looking responses to ensure Africa's resilience and self-determined economic transformation. And this is one of a series of webinars and podcasts and discussions I will be organizing. The ongoing trade tensions, as you have seen, exemplified by the current Trump tariffs, and also going back to the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, which was undertaken in 2022. And they are not a new phenomena, because earlier, the U.S. administration under Bush, under Obama, and the first Trump administration or imposed tariffs on China, especially targeting strategic sectors like solar panels, electric vehicles, and textiles. And these measures for the US were a part of a broader resurgence of their industrial policy, but also we have seen other measures from other countries also. And these measures are at odds with a liberal trade agenda they have been previously championing. Herbert, you have asked about the unilateral trade measures, tariffs and sanctions and conditionalities imposed by developed countries. Africa has long been subjected to all these unilateral measures. We have been subjected to unilateral trade measures, to tariffs, to sanctions, to conditionalities. And I can give examples. We have had economic conditionalities under the World Bank, IMF, the structured adjustment programs. Those were almost trade conditionalities. We have also seen other unilateral measures, as I will point out. But maybe to go back to the structured adjustment programs, these promoted liberalization, privatization, deregulation, and we even liberalized our capital account, which has led to externalization and outflow of our finances. And when you look at the structured adjustment programs, there were conditionalities, we never discussed them, and they have really undermined our development and our industrialization. We have also seen unilateral measures under the EU Green Deal. We have seen directives, the EU Deforestation Directive. We have seen the CBAM, So, and these measures are penalizing African countries, penalizing farmers who never polluted in the first place. Again, when we go back a little bit further under the Lomé EU-Africa trade, under the Lomé negotiations, and under the everything but arms initiatives, they were good initiatives to give us a market, but they told us we have to export raw materials, and through tariff escalation, where tariffs are added onto products when you add value, we have remained commodity-dependent countries. I want to go to the issue of AGOA. A number of countries, mine included, we already offer AGOA, but AGOA also had stringent eligibility conditions. For example, one of the conditionalities was that we had to eliminate all countries which were to benefit from AGOA, had to eliminate barriers to US trade and investment. And I remember in 2016, in the East African region, the East African community wanted to promote and grow their textile industry, the textile value chain. So they proposed to increase taxes on second-hand clothes all of them, from wherever. And we got a lot of pressure from the US, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania removed the tariffs. Rwanda refused to remove the tariffs, and Rwanda was removed from the AGOA list. So you can see that even AGOA, it had unilateral measures attached and conditionalities attached to them. And when you look at most of the AGOA beneficiaries have been exporting raw materials, Ghana, it's cocoa, Ethiopia, coffee, and maybe some textiles. When you look at Lesotho, they were exporting textiles, a good amount of textiles, and employing a number of workers, especially women, around 40,000 workers. But the textile sector remained an enclave. It wasn't related to the wider economy. There was no backward linkages to producing yarn or producing cotton. And because the AGOA had the third country fabric rule, countries benefiting or exporting textiles could source apparel and fabrics from all over, you know. So our countries remained countries just making clothes, you know, without any industrialization, you know. So when you look at again AGOA, whether it's going to be renewed, which is not very probable because AGOA is ending in September, but I think we need to negotiate and to negotiate these conditionalities attached to AGOA. So when you look at sanctions, I have read, I don't know whether people have read this book by Yash Tandon, Trade is War. Very, very interesting. And he makes a remark that sanctions, it's an economic warfare, you know, that sanctions can be tantamount to acts of war, you know, and he gives a number of examples like Cuba, you know, and that sanctions represent tools of coercive diplomacy. So again, you look at AGOA, you look at the EBA, they are a sort of a coercive diplomacy. The other question was regarding counter strategies to address the current challenges. Before I look at the strategies, I think we need to address the challenges facing Africa in the context of the ongoing trade tensions and wars. One of the most fundamental challenges facing the continent is the fragmentation. We are fragmented, and our response is we are responding as individual countries, and we are reactive. We knew that there are trade wars, there are sanctions, but we haven't sat as Africa to be able to come up with a joint response to these issues. Yet we have progressive frameworks. We have the CFTA, we have Agenda 2063, yet we are fragmented. In fact, when you look at the response to AGOA, South Africa is talking about negotiating bilaterally with the US, even Lesotho. But we have seen other individual responses, individually countries, African countries, negotiating with major powers. An example is Kenya. Kenya, despite the fact that as East African community, we have a common external tariff, they went ahead and signed an economic partnership agreement with the EU, which is undermining our integrity as a regional economic groupings. But the European Union has gone ahead to negotiate with other individual countries on the continent. Yet, as Africa Union, we had agreed that we need to concretize our CFTA before we sign agreements with third parties. We have also seen the scramble for Africa between the EU, the US, China, for example, the Lobito corridor. The EU and US, they are building that railway, connecting Angola, Zambia, DRC to get the minerals, and that railway line is going to end on Lobito. That's why in Angola. That's why it's called the Lobito Corridor. But it's also an initiative to counter the China and Belt, China's Belt and Road Initiative. So without a coherent continental voice, we are risking being a pawn in this the powers are scrambling, and we are going to become pawns. And when you look at all this, the impact of the sanctions, the impact of our inability to have a coherent position, it has been that because we aspire to structurally transform our economies, but it's just an inspiration. We haven't concretized it. Africa, we are still heavily dependent on primary commodity exports with limited progression towards industrialization. And it's because of all these issues. So briefly, I can talk about how we can craft our own path as Africa. Yeah, we need to have a paradigm shift. We need to leverage on those plans we have, the Agenda 2063, the Lagos Plan of Action, the CFTA. You know, this can be a foundation for collective action and collective resilience. We need to reassess and put more energy in the implementation of the CFTA, which we are not doing. The CFTA has many challenges because the CFTA concentrated on liberalization, tariff liberalization. We need to address other issues, fundamental issues like trade infrastructure on the continent, trade facilitation, issues of production, issues of finance. So we need to be serious, you know. We need also to concentrate more on regional integration as a launching pad to strengthen our regional economic groupings, economic communities, harmonize policies, promote regional value chains, and promote intra-Africa trade. You know, we are not doing that. We are, in fact, promoting relationship with outsiders, with the European Union, with the US, signing agreements which is not very good. And we need to assess, because what's also good about the Trump tariffs is the debunking of a number of narratives they have been pushing on us. You know, that tariffs, we need to liberalize. You know, when we talk about protectionism, it's like, you know, it's a dirty word. But if US can talk about protectionism, what about developing countries? And I leave you with a book by Hajun Chang, Kicking Away the Ladder. This is how developed countries developed by using these policies, protectionism, tariffs. But we need to be selective. We need to be purposive, you know, not just to be reactive. We need to anchor our efforts also at the domestic level, domestic and regional level. Produce, industrialize regional value chains and trade. We need to capture our domestic and regional markets. You can't capture the Goa market in the US when you can't capture your domestic and regional markets. So we need to rethink what we do. We need to rethink to ensure multilateralism is working for us. Maybe, I don't know what time I have. That's okay. Maybe later I will look at other issues. But thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Ms. Jane Alunga, the Executive Director of Southern and Eastern Africa Trade Information and Negotiations Institute, CIATINI, for putting in context quite a range of issues, including the global dynamics, but also elucidating on where we are as Africa and why we are where we are. And also shedding light on the fact that the ongoing trade tensions have only been exemplified by the US Inflation Reduction Act that brought back the industrial policy, because there is a time when the industrial policy wasn't something countries were prioritizing. But now it's back on the agenda. Every country is prioritizing the same. And how Africa's experience with different trade regimes hasn't been really good enough, because it has entrenched us to be at the lower end of the global value chain. It has deepened poverty, among other challenges that we continue to experience. You talked about the issue of our experience with structure adjustment programs. Structure adjustment programs had many promises, but at the end of the day, we were at crossroads in terms of development. So as we continue with the discussion, we need to also collectively think about how to salvage the situation. Ms. Jane Alunga has attempted to share some proposals on how we can salvage the situation. The issue of coming up with a common African position is needed, especially on policy tools and directives that are coming from the global north, such as European Union. We have the EU Green Deal that has a cocktail of different policy tools, and these have far-reaching implications on livelihoods of different stakeholders and actors, such as smallholder farmers, among others, but also the coffee value chain actors. The European Union Deforestation Regulation has far-reaching implications. But all that cannot be addressed if we don't have a common position. And one would wonder, doesn't Africa have policy tools or frameworks that can help to guide our development? We have them. Ms. Jane Alunga talked about Agenda 2063 that spells out the Africa that we want. Maybe we need to question, is it just about the Africa we want or the Africa we need? We need to challenge ourselves on what we need to do right. Look at the different policy frameworks under Agenda 2063. Africa Mining Vision, it has even been overtaken by events because countries delayed to domesticate the same, to operationalize the same. There are a number of other policy initiatives. The CFTA, African Continental Free Trade Area, is here. But beyond signing and ratifying, there is a lot that countries need to put in place because the CFTA is not self-executing. There are really different steps countries need to take in order to position themselves, mobilize the private sector, micro, small, and medium enterprises, and trade, be ready to trade. But also you cannot trade without an enabling environment. The logistical infrastructure is also challenging because Africa is still curtailed to trade because of lack of sufficient shipping lines. That's all a challenge. And Ms. Jane Alunga continued to elucidate on the long-standing relationship between SCP, African, Caribbean, and Pacific, Africa in general, with European Union that is rooted within the Lomé Convention, the Cotonou, among other partnerships that Africa is pursuing. More recently, there was suspension of some countries from the African Growth Opportunity Act, AGOA, and Uganda is one of the countries that were expelled, finally expelled. At first suspended, then later expelled. So it means multilateralism and the global trading system has quite a number of challenges. And so this webinar is also aimed at providing some recommendations, actionable recommendations on how we can salvage the situation, but also how to position Africa favorably in global trade. And to help us elucidate further on the issue of extraterritorial trade-related measures, such as unilateral sanctions, export controls, and financial restrictions, and the serious challenges they pose to Africa's sovereignty and development planning, is Ms. Vahini Naidu. She'll be responding to a few guiding questions, including how the framing of trade as a tool of war changed the role of multilateral institutions like the World Trade Organization in mediating global trade disputes. But she will also continue to share with us and weigh in to what extent does she, in her position, see the United States tariffs on China as an extension of geopolitical rivalry rather than just economic policy? And I would like to hand over power at this level to the next moderator, who is Mr. Martin Munu Luther, who is a PhD candidate at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. Comrade Munu Martin, I'd like to hand over to you to take us through the next sessions and sharing. Thank you. But as I hand over, I would like to call upon Vahini to take us through her presentation. Thank you.
Fellow participants, and we're very happy at South Center to be co-organizing this event with Ziatini.
Yes, we can see.
Yeah, okay. The next one on extraterritorial trade-related measures. Yes? Okay, so just very briefly, the idea that Trump, of course, has introduced so many trade actions just in the last probably 10 weeks or so is really a representation of quite an aggressive tariff policy approach, with sweeping tariffs under the so-called emergency powers, with a 10% baseline tariff on nearly all imports. But also tariffs increasingly under the Trump administration is being tied to non-trade objectives. So, for instance, we are seeing tariffs on China, Mexico, and Canada, which are being used as leverage on migration and drug control issues, for instance, which is increasingly blurring the line between trade and national security. The next idea or kind of notion that's emerging from Trump's policy is reciprocal measures under their review. And here the administration is reviewing foreign extraterritorial taxes in the form of undertaking investigations on digital services taxes on American firms in foreign countries with a view to possible retaliation. There are no formal extraterritorial sanctions yet, but a memorandum, a presidential memorandum, has already been issued. And finally, just a point on this notion of extraterritorial sanctions. I think the difference between like the normal secondary sanctions that we know.
Bahini,
Hello.
your slides are not moving. Are you presenting? Your slides are not moving.
Yes, I am. Can you see my first slide on extraterritorial measures?
No, it's just the first slide, the cover slide. They are not moving. Now?
Not really. Yes. That's fine.
Oh, you can see this?
Yes.
Ah. Okay, so this is the slide that I've been referring to. Okay, and so just like kind of focusing specifically on this slide now, we're seeing different kinds of trade measures that are being taken by the Trump administration. For instance, we have, it's kind of divided into different themes. So there are across-the-board tariffs, and here I just really only listed about 6. But I think in total we're looking at not less than 16 different kinds of measures or policy instruments that are being used. So there are across-the-board tariffs, like the reciprocal tariff announced on 2nd of April, the 10% universal tariff, the specific targeted tariffs on China, and then the 25% tariffs on Canada, Mexico, under the USMCA. Then we also have sector-specific tariffs, and this kind of primarily deals with steel and aluminium, autos and auto parts, semiconductors and pharmaceuticals, also agriculture, idea is also around kind of enforcement actions that the Trump administration have announced. For example, they are going to be conducting much more stricter checks on USMCA and Chinese content. So this is the idea of rules of origin. And then quite importantly, but I think this isn't getting as much publicity as it should, is the idea of this anti-transshipment measure, where basically the Trump administration have announced that they are going to be seeking legal action against countries who are kind of routing Chinese goods or Chinese manufactured products via third countries. And of course, there's also the product exemptions, which have been announced recently to protect critical U.S. sectors. And just very briefly, there are also the notions of like tariffs or non-trade objectives under the garb of national security, drugs and migration, and also several announcements about investigations and reviews that are going to be conducted. I'm moving to my next slide. Can you see it? It's on the WTO dispute settlement. No? Okay, I think you should see it now.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So just very briefly, before I talk about the impact on WTO disputes, I just wanted to talk about the instrument that the Trump administration is using. And this is under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is known as the IEEPA. And its implications, because this has a direct correlation between cases brought to the WTO vis-a-vis the U.S.'s defense, that these measures have been introduced in the name of essential security interests. So, for instance, under this act, it gives quite expansive executive authority to the U.S. president, where it basically allows the U.S. president to impose economic restrictions and even to tariffs unilaterally during a declared national emergency. And the specific language in the legislation refers to foreign threats. So unlike traditional trade remedies, it bypasses the normal investigative procedures and congressional approval that kind of precede, for instance, the Section 301 investigations. And so this is also very concerning because it enables very quick, swift, broad action with very little checks and balances within the U.S. system itself when these kind of disruptive policies are introduced and its commensurate impact on developing countries. Another kind of big concern with the Emergency Powers Act is that it also bypasses multilateral trade rules in the sense that tariffs that have been imposed under the Emergency Economic Powers Act are not really grounded in WTO consistent disciplines like safeguard or anti-dumping. It's really like challenging the legal basis for U.S. commitments. And I think overall, what we're increasingly going to see, the more and more these kinds of measures get challenged in the WTO, is that it's weakening the kind of the predictability and our expectation of kind of adhering to most favored nation within the WTO. And I think it also invites a lot of potential WTO disputes that the U.S. may dismiss as non-justiciable or non-litigious. And finally, the point that kind of relates to this particular slide is the kind of orchestrated agenda by the United States to kind of undermine the WTO dispute settlement system, where they have been rejecting WTO rulings on national security grounds, asserting that such matters lie outside WTO jurisdiction. But it's also combined with the U.S. blockage of the WTO appellate body, which has, as we all know, rendered the WTO enforcement completely hollow and dysfunctional. And so this really leaves a very important enforcement right of recourse for countries to really seek legal redress against unilateral coercion. Now, this particular graph, kind of exemplifying the erosion of this WTO dispute settlement mechanism, where it kind of shows that if you look from like 2018, requests for consultations, which is the first step in WTO dispute, fell dramatically from 38 requests for consultations in 2018 to just 5 in 2020. And this is, it's really been very modestly increased over the years, in recent years. But I think overall, our conclusion is that it reflects a growing skepticism about the value of pursuing cases in a system that lacks enforcement. We're also seeing, the shift to kind of other temporary arrangements, such as multi-party interim arbitration arrangement mechanisms that a small club of countries have developed outside of the WTO framework. But I think overall, these kind of ad hoc tools lack the universality and the legal certainty that would be needed to anchor a rules-based multilateral trading system. But specifically to answer your question, and I move into the next slide now, is in relation to this rise in unilateral measures and, the idea that, seeing such an exponential increase and escalation at speed and scale, where the U.S. raised tariffs on Chinese imports from a baseline 10% in February to as high as 245% by mid-April, citing drugs, migration, and reciprocal retaliation. And so China has matched this with triple-digit tariffs, import bans, export controls on critical minerals. Also, there's a larger focus now on, kind of moving away from trade to technology and the minerals war. So beyond tariffs, I think we're going to see the weaponization of non-tariff measures. And some examples here just include the U.S. has announced that they will be undertaking a number of national security reviews. I have mentioned the rules of origin and more stricter enforcement of it, and planned tariffs on semiconductors, etc. But overall, in terms of like the global supply chain, I think a lot of countries and a lot of developing countries who have managed to kind of have or participate in some of these high value chains are going to be caught in the crossfire. And this escalation does, of course, impact critical sectors such as energy, agriculture, electronics. And I think overall it is going to increase the uncertainty for the country. But moving on to your second question, I didn't prepare a slide on this, but this is in relation to kind of the geopolitical rivalry between the U.S. and China, and where does the global South kind of fit into this? And I think essentially, this idea is that the idea is that, or the sense that we're getting increasingly is that the U.S. trade policy agenda is not really about just trade, it's really a geostrategic context. And so if we see these latest tariffs reaching up to 145% and targeting semiconductors, artificial intelligence, minerals, these are not really conventional trade remedies. And we, at least in our preliminary assessment, at the South Center, we view these tools in a broader kind of power struggle for technological and military dominance. In addition, I think China's countermeasures, including rare earth export controls, also reflect, kind of a strategic decoupling. And in a way, this is also kind of reminiscent of the Cold War style of economic containment. But I guess the dynamics are quite significantly different now with the global economy being far more interlinked. And therefore, the collateral damage is going to be not only wider, but also deeper. Generally, I would also want to say, and I'll just probably take just a few more seconds, is just to point out that the global South countries are caught in the middle. For instance, we're seeing India and Vietnam, for instance, are being kind of ported as alternative manufacturing hubs. You have Brazil and South Africa who are facing spillovers in agriculture and kind of coordination, strong political will, and this ability to kind of follow through on implementation, it does risk becoming collateral damage in this kind of time of crossfire. And just finally, I want to end my point by saying that I think the WTO's recent dispute settlement system really leaves a lot of countries, African, ASEAN, Latin American countries, quite vulnerable to a rules-based vacuum that is dominated by economic power and not legal principles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fahim, for the wonderful presentation. My name is Munu, and as Herbert said, I'm taking over the moderation from him. And my apologies for also joining in late. I had a serious dental issue with my child, but hopefully everything is fine now. So, Fahim mentioned very important issues. First, the aggressive trade policy implementation and the changes that the Trump administration is implementing. But we see within very short time these changes coming up, and so it's also not certain in terms of what it means or what are the implications for this on the multilateral trade system. And the issue of the erosion of the WTO dispute settlement mechanism is of paramount importance for us to interrogate, especially when the U.S. invokes its national security interests. Of course, the case law on its national security interests has been not so supportive of how the U.S. is viewing it now, because the interpretation of it is not as wide and as self-learning as the U.S. under the Trump administration is pushing. And then the issue of using tariffs, district policies for other non-trade objectives. Also, Wahid mentioned it clearly, and the vulnerability that developing countries face. Of course, the developing countries and the African countries, in our case, they are of interest. We are already vulnerable, as Jen also mentioned, and the trading system were quite imbalanced for these countries. So this only worsens the situation for African countries, and it is important for us to devise effective means through which we can navigate this as Africa. And the next speaker is Mr. Amidst, whom was already introduced with his broad experience and as the coordinator of sanctions in Southern Africa. The broader challenge is the need to ensure that development works for the people. And we also know that Africa is very strategically disadvantaged in the negotiation. And yet, we want the trade rules to promote the goal of equitable and inclusive development. So, we would like you to give us an overview of what frameworks, be it at the regional or unilateral level, or even top-down cooperation, that you think African countries can use to advance their interests. Then secondly, to give us the what strategic objectives behind this, behind the U.S. imposition of tariffs on China. Are these goals being really achieved, or are we are witnessing something which is a prolonged economic settlement? And then Professor Yash Tandon's book, where he suggested trade that can resonate with that trade can be seen trade policies or can be seen as really war or economic coercion. So how do these actions we see resonate with the historical patterns of imperialism in this case? And then lastly, on the right, maybe you also tell us whether these tariffs are a defensive response to unfair practices or they are really preemptive in the ongoing war of technological and industrial dominance, especially between the US and China. So you are welcome. Mr. Lagan, are you there?
Hello, Martin.
Yes.
He's off.
Or is off? Maybe we move to Edgar. When he comes back, he can rejoin us. Mr. Edgar Odari, the Executive Director of Econews Africa, you have broadly very much experience on the critical issues of climate change and the new environmental and trade and environment law. And so we also understand that trade discourse, there are of course implications of this for African economies. So now the main question for you, Mr. Edgar, is can protectionism, as used by the US, be interpreted as legitimate tool for self-reliance in the global south, rather than a taboo policy? And then, secondly, we would also like you to tell us, with measures such as the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism gaining traction, the deforestation agreement measures, the anti-deforestation measures in the EU gaining traction. So we'd like to tell us how Africa can guard against this becoming covert forms of green protectionism or economic coercion that constrain industrialization and development in Africa. Jen also alluded to that, but maybe you can expand to us much more with your experience. So Edgar, you're welcome.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me to have this conversation. You know, we live in interesting times. I just basically I have 4 slides that I'll be able to get in my discussion. So, at the end of the Cold War in, early 90s, there was, for those of you who read Francis Fukuyama, he declared that we were witnessing what he called the end of history, where the dialectic clash between liberal democracy and communism had led to the final form of human government where liberal democracy had won over communism. So what we were basically seeing that time was, because the Soviet Union had collapsed and the Berlin Wall had fallen, everyone was celebrating in the mood and saying, look, this is the end of history for those of you who read the historical dialectism, materialism and dialectism. So this was being argued as having been the triumph. Now, what we are seeing today, in today's world, the world has completely changed upside down. And we are maybe saying the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama predicted, maybe had never come at us. And this is an interesting time today, because you're seeing the unraveling of the post-World War II consensus. Then the question then becomes, what is the way forward? Yeah. So, having said that, I would say Africa is the only place where we are now still negotiating opening up of markets. You wake up, I don't mean this with the ACFTA, because if the ACFTA is properly addressed, it can be a good starting point for Africa to trade with itself. But the way it's been opened up, we are basically opening up our borders to external actors from Europe, US, and whatnot to be able to come into our market. So, at this time in history, Africa is the only continent that is neutralizing. Everyone else is protected. And I say this with interest because actually the whole world has moved back to protectionism. And, there's a Swahili saying that says, "Mkuki kwa nguruwe mtamu, kwa binadamu mchungu." What it basically means, when you use a spear, when you spear a pig, that is nice. The meat is sweet. But when the spear turns against the human being, then you say, oh, that's painful. The West has always used trade policy as a tool to be able to get what it wants. So one time when it woke up, when the US, if you think about the history of the WTO, the US was instrumental in bringing up the WTO cooperation. And after some point, Babani was showing us the slide that talks about the settlement. So when the cases started piling up against the US, and the US started losing at the WTO, they then turned back again into the system and saying, we now want to frustrate the WTO, this resettlement system. And that's problematic, because You cannot say a system is only good if it works for your interests. Yeah? So if that is the case, then Africa needs to move back to protectionism and basically protect the entire continent and basically start looking inward in terms of the way to be able to grow itself. Because if Europe is looking inward, you have the rise of right-wing parties that are basically talking about protectionism. Europe is looking inward, America is looking inward. So South America has always had this process where they are inward and outward looking at the same time. So it seems, if you look at China, China is also concentrating on its domestic market. They basically want to ramp up consumption locally so that they can stop depending on an export-led strategy for growth. So everyone is looking inward. Africa is the only continent that is witnessing a reversal where we want to look outside for our development. So I would say, in reality, you look at protectionism and how it has been crafted, it is actually a legitimate tool for growth and inward-looking development. That's number one. Number two, you talk about the environmental measures that are being taken. And it's interesting. Look at CBAM. Recently, the International Maritime Organization passed, they are going to be levying some sort of tax to be able to address the carbon footprint of the shipping industry. So everyone seems to be passing these processes. The EU CBAM, the forestry regulations. But if you look at what they really are, they continue with the history where, so if you tell me, for example, why is it that raw materials and minerals coming from Africa, you are not exposed to the kind of carbon footprint requirements you see in Europe, but then you want to export finished products. So finished products are actually high in CBAM, but then raw materials are not. So that's the whole chain of consumerism. They basically want to get raw materials here and be able to use them for the industries there. So even the so-called measures to be able to address carbon footprint, they are a bit disingenuous because they are only meant to work when you're benefiting from your neighbor and not necessarily to be able to address climate change and its reality in full context. So having said that, the key policy domains that we need to watch. Are you watching my screen? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. So there are key policies that we need to watch in this space. Number one is trade policy. We are seeing tariffs, we are seeing a lot of inward-looking industrialization. If you look at the US, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act and now what Trump is proposing as tariffs, they are basically going to change the whole setup the way you're going to see. Investment policy is going to shift because countries are looking at attracting investment. Even developed countries like the US are looking at how do we change this more than be able to attract investment inward. Then you have development policy issues, such as behind the border policies such as innovation. Countries are looking at technology, skills, and infrastructure. And this is interesting because if you look at Africa, Africa has the program for international development in Africa. But the way it is structured and the decision-making process for it is problematic because we've given foreigners the free way to be able to determine what kind of infrastructure they're built for. So most of what is being built out of here is, mind pot. You are basically taking products away from the periphery and basically taking them outside for export and development from that point. So that's problematic. We also need to talk about finance policy and how Africa can leverage finance policy to start addressing issues of domestic resource mobilization. There's also the competitiveness. They talk about national competitiveness. Africa cannot talk about national competitiveness because some of our markets are very small. So how do we talk about regional value chain that James was talking about? How do we make ourselves competitive at a regional level, for example? You talk about the Lobito corridor in Mozambique. Why are we taking those products to the port? We're taking them from DSC all the way to the port, where some of those products are required to be consumed at the African continent. Why can't we, for example, have the processing happening in Rwanda and the manufacturing of those products happening maybe in Zambia, for example? Yeah. Then the risk management policy issues we need to discuss. Having said that, we need to be realistic about what's happening at the global moment. We need to look at interest. This is about interest. And there are two things that are happening. Number one, people are looking at Africa for raw materials, and they are looking at Africa as a market for finished products. So, you talk about the EU Critical Raw Materials Act, you talk about the the US Inflation Reduction Act, then the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum Supply Chain Agreement, the the critical minerals agreement with Japan, all those issues are quite significant. The US-Japan critical minerals agreement, then Jen has mentioned it. So we have the China Belt and Road Initiative, which involves around acquisitions, stakes in mines, and the provision of infrastructure in exchange for the exploitation of raw material. That is problematic because, we seem to be having everyone else determine what we live as a continent instead of doing it ourselves. So in terms of infrastructure, you have the China Belt and Road Initiative, you have the EU gateway. They've now developed their own gateway program they are bringing to the continent. So we have PIDA as being a continental process that's not controlled by us. So we have PIDA, we have the China Belt and Road Initiative, and we have the EU gateway. So at what point do these things speak to the African interests the way we want to address them? Then in terms of markets, you have efforts. We need to, AGOA is expiring at the end of this year, and we have the Made in China 55 strategy that was very effective and it's being reviewed now to be able to address other issues. So having said that, I would actually say that it is time to look at the global, this is like a war. You read their status quo. These people, they come with these policies, and these policies are meant to subjugate the African continent and basically be able to create a market for themselves while extracting raw materials. It's basically extractivism at its best. I'll stop there and maybe say to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edgar. You mentioned very important issue of the post-World War II consensus that in the global West, the global agenda of promoting liberalism, using institutions and the WTO, with, of course, leadership of the US, and this system seemed to be working for the American interests for quite a while, until over the last, we could say, with the rise of China and other newly industrialized countries. So I want to pick up your thoughts on, again, on the issue of taking away the land as per Handel.
Yes.
Because these industrial policies that are now coming back into the public domain, some of them, especially on the issue of tariff, the issue of protecting, building the competitiveness of African economies, were dismissed a few years ago as outdated, but now we see them coming back. So what would be your take to African countries? You talked about protectionism. So I'd like to know, maybe from your take, whether you think African countries can use this, and if so, how? How can African countries use the changing dynamics of industrial policy coming back into play to again play the same game and strengthen the argument of the need to protect and build competitiveness of African economies?
Yes, interesting conversation in this matter. So, it's interesting because looking across Africa today, in terms of, this news being made, Africa is going to be punished by the US, by tariffs and whatnot. If you look at what that happened, most of the products that we export are primary products. Raw materials, be it commodities like coffee, tea, then be it mining resources like cobalt, coltan and whatnot. All these things are being used across the globe. So really, it's a question of how can Africa best harness these resources and be able to use them for growth? Because we talk about structural transformation. And it's interesting because all this is political economy. It's a political economy question that you've asked me. And when I usually look at political economy, I ask myself a few questions. Who are the players? What are their interests? What are the relationships that exist between them? And what is their respective mobilizing capacity to be able to push for their interests? So Africa has leverage to be able to push for its interests. And what it has are raw material that the world actively needs at the moment. So what you need to do, if you wake up, the challenge is the fragmentation that we see with African leaders and their inability to coalesce around issues. Because, if Africa can be able to harness its resources and basically say, look, I don't know how many of you were able to see, maybe we get some time I can be able to show you on the screen. there was scenarios analysis that was done by the World Economic Forum on the mining and metal scenarios going up to 2030. And they are bringing very interesting perspectives out of it. Because they're saying, there was possibility of fertilization. Yeah. So why can Africa, for example, wake up today and decide to adopt a fertilization strategy where we say we are limiting, or China has banned the export of raw material, rare earths from China. And if you look at, I have a slide somewhere, maybe I think get a chance to show it. China controls about 60% of production of those raw material, rare earths. Then in terms of processing, it controls around 90% of that. Yeah. So if you look at what is happening today with that ban in response to the US tariffs, it means if the likes of Glencore who are going to be making money, because Glencore is able to basically speculate on these issues and be able to speculate on how global commodities work. So it's private firms like Glencore who are going to be making most of this money. Why can Africa wake up and decide to use acceleration strategy and say, we are going to ban all export of minerals from Africa? If you want to develop products, come and develop them across the continent. Then you harness all the resources you have to be able to use them. Because for me, that might be the first radical step towards realizing what you need to do in terms of sovereignty. Because that will force all the other actors to sit down and negotiate and have a better day. And that happened, at a point, Zambia was being problematic based on those scenarios, and the US started deciding to form an agreement with the US, Zambia, and DRC for the production of green minerals, especially relating to, electric batteries. So it's possible to have this kind of conversation, because if you really think about it, kicking away the ladder, I want to allude to your remark about kicking away the ladder. So when Africa was trying to impose import substitution policies in the early 70s and 60s and 70s, they said, no, you don't need that kind of industrial policy because it's going to mess up the global order. In the 1980s, during the Reagan Thatcher neoliberal push, they said, no, what you need to do is basically open up the market, let the free hand of the market start to develop. That has not happened because of the structural adjustment program that they implemented. So now, after all that has happened, meanwhile, if you look at the history of all these countries, including Europe started as a monopoly. If you look at the European economic community, the initial countries that started, they are basically looking at it as a steel agreement. And they studied how they're going to trade with steel, and afterwards they were able to harness these resources and basically be able to come up with what they have today as the EU. And you look at it today, even the EU is unraveling, because countries are now looking inward in terms of they're cancelling their foreign assistance budgets, and they are basically looking inward towards defense spending and manufacturing, ramping up manufacturing in their area. So I'll say now they are looking at having an inward-led industrial policy at a time when they have kicked away the ladder for Africa and other developing countries. They are telling them don't do this because it's not good for the market. But now that the market has shown them a bit of that, they now want to go back and say, oh, look, you need to now start looking inward for industrial policy. I'll stop there and sit to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edgar, for exploring these issues. And I want to go back to Rahim. Rahim, you mentioned very important points in terms of building multilateralism. So I'd like to take it on from there. With your experience as a negotiator and now at South Delta, African countries for a long time complained unfairness in the international trading system. When you look at the issues of the agreement on agriculture, the failure to address development issues, and the emergence of new issues like the digital economy or the e-commerce agreement under the joint assessment initiative. But now, this same multilateral institution, the WTO, African countries have for years complained of it being insufficient and even in some cases undermining their development interest. It's itself now facing an institutional crisis, looking at the US failure to refusal to appoint the appellate body members, but also the emergence of these new unilateral measures that makes it even difficult to challenge. So I'd like to know from you, what do you think, what would be your recommendations on the approach for African countries in terms of engaging at the WTO and trying to save what is left of the institution, but also we know the importance of the institution, especially in providing a forum where smaller African countries or smaller economies can still use to leverage in terms of promoting, to leverage their resources and leverage their expertise to promote their development and interest. So what could be now the next steps for the strategy that African countries need to take?
Thank you so much, Manu. It's a bit of a complex question, but I'll give it a go. I think, one of the biggest challenges that I'm seeing kind of emerging in this present moment is, this idea that because the US is basically kind of challenging and dismantling the very system it was, that it created for itself to serve its own industrial kind of policy objectives and trade objectives, is that I think we naturally feel an obligation to want to save the WTO. And increasingly, I'm kind of seeing this kind of narrative emerging that we are, in some ways, kind of obliged from a moral perspective to kind of save the system. And one of the biggest challenges that I see from this is that, and this is really also a South-centered perspective, is that our defense as the global South, as developing countries, as an institution that serves the needs of developing countries, is that our defense for multilateralism is not the status quo. It is not the current system. Of course, we all support a rules-based system, but it has been shown through several decades, 3 decades now, of proof that the WTO does not necessarily serve the necessary development imperatives of the majority of the global South. And so this kind of goes back to the structural asymmetries that are embedded in the WTO, in the so-called rules-based system that was created essentially to protect and preserve global North interests. And so, if I was looking at this from an African perspective, I think, of course, the idea would be to champion a long-standing African group proposals with respect to food security, with respect to kind of reforming these very, very asymmetrical and structurally biased rules. So my first kind of recommendation would be that we would have to open up the agreement on agriculture. We would have to address serious deficiencies regarding subsidy reform that is needed and that has distorted global markets. I think also, our defense for food security should also potentially be justified from the lens of national security. What stops us as developing countries or as the global South to say that it is in our own national security interest and our essential security interest to defend and feed our people, and therefore our essential food sovereignty and food security is a national security issue, and therefore undertake or do whatever you need to do to be able to produce food and to provide food for your people. The other issue, and I think it's more of a low-hanging fruit issue, so the Africa group over the last, I would say 6 to 7 years has been championing this idea of reforming the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures, and which is the ASDM. And I think that's a really, really fundamental component. But one of the unfortunate kind of repercussions of going down that road that we have seen is that the EU, for instance, the US, kind of also want to unravel this agreement for their own kind of nefarious purposes to introduce subsidies under the garb of either national security or in the name of climate change or in the name of trade-related climate measures or the green transition. And so here, I think one of the important kind of considerations, if I was looking at it from a purely African perspective, would be that most or the majority of African countries don't have the fiscal space to really make use of a reformed ASDM. And so while we are fully, supporting the idea that this agreement should be reformed and that, we need to have a relook at subsidies, I actually think that there may be more appetite and more kind of practical ways in which we could potentially look at trim measures, kind of look at the introduction of local content requirements, performance requirements, where I think many African countries, in the context of both the African continental FTA, but also the WTO, would be able to make better use of this policy tool rather than not having, for instance, a fiscal policy space available. And so here, I think the African group's agenda to kind of pursue their proposals under the G90 agreement, specific proposals in the Committee on Trade and Development in special session, as it relates to balance of payments, as it relates to the TRIPS agreement and technology transfer, and primarily TRIM. I think these are really important tools that would provide some kind of immediate relief to countries who are on the path of pursuing industrial policy and industrial development. The other issue, and I don't know if this is extremely radical or not, but I've been thinking about a very important kind of outcome that we are constantly faced with in the pursuit of developing new rules in the WTO, and that is that when we enter into rules or we undertake international obligations, they are always about restricting your government from doing something or prohibiting your government from doing something, right? So this is taking away the development ladder. This is how do we reclaim our policy space in an area that we have kind of given away so many years ago, and for some reason we are bound by these very, very old and probably I would say outdated rules. So in the context of agriculture, for instance, I mean we're looking at an external reference price with respect to how we notify the amount of subsidies that we can give, which is tied to prices that were set in the 1980s. And so I think this is really not, this one, it was not the intention, it was just really an anomaly that happened and then became entrenched. Another issue is that we kind of enter into new rules and they have no end date. So we kind of enter into it without any bigger picture kind of scenario to understand that these rules will eventually, come to an end, or that they would be time bound or something. And so this is where we have started kind of looking into the idea that maybe one of the ways to unlock the kind of negotiating deadlock in the WTO is that we should consider the option of having time bound rules. And I understand that in some instances, in some specific rules, it may not make logical sense to kind of have a time-bound rule. But I think there would be much more impetus and political will for policymakers to kind of enter into a new round of policymaking if they knew that these agreements are only going to last for 15 years or they're only going to last for 10 or 20 years, with a mandatory renegotiation clause that's built into these agreements. So it kind of forces you or kind of imposes an obligation on you as a member state to recognize that the realities may have changed. These rules may not be working anymore. They may not have served their purpose. And therefore, there is a need to renegotiate this agreement or to renegotiate this particular rule. So I mean, I guess those are kind of more of the ideas that I think could potentially see the light of day in the system. And finally, if I was just looking at this in the context of, this topic of trade as war and all of that, I would say that there's obviously a very urgent need for multilateralism to also reflect like multipolarity. That the WTO cannot be built around US preferences alone. Developing countries, and we've seen this through so many groupings, the G30, the African group, the ACP group, the LDC group, the NFIDPs, where groups of developing countries are really pushing for fairer, more equitable rules, whether it be in agriculture, IP, industrial policy, digital trade. And so here, I guess the idea or the point I'm trying to make is that we should kind of, recognize, yes, that the world is changing, that the WTO cannot stay in the kind of static way that it is, and that significant reforms are needed. And I would seriously urge that we refocus our efforts on the development dimension, which I believe is sorely lacking in the present system. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bahini, for your elaborate response and the need to work towards making the WTO reflective of multipolarity and pursuing quick wins in the Pacific Agreement, promoting performance requirements in investments. And at this point, I would like to open up the webinar to responses from the participants. So if you, the participants, I see a number of participants here. So if you have any questions or comments, please you can come in and be brief. So I now open this. You can raise your hand and then you will be selected. Yes, Edgar, you have something more to say, please?
Yes. Unfortunately, I don't share the optimism that Bahini has on the WTO system. I don't. Because, when the system was being built around that time, countries were told to sign on those agreements, and African countries signed things they did not understand. Then after they realized that and started pushing out the door, just imagine, Africa has been pushing for a WTO agenda since 2001 in the Doha round. So since 2001, we've been struggling to talk about issues that were discussed in Doha. This is 2025, 2 decades later. We have not been able to achieve that. So I don't know what magic in this you're going to use to be able to come up with a system that we want to change the WTO. Because for me, I always say, I ask myself, who are the players at WTO? What are their interests? What are the relations that exist between them? And what is their capacity to push for their interests? The US and the EU have capacity to push for their interests. And because of that, we may need to, I'm not saying we completely do away with the system, but given this time of paralysis, it might be a good time to reorient policy so that by the time we engage in the process, we have been able to solve our internal issues. That's my opinion on it, and it's very difficult to change. Thank you.
Thank you, Edgar, for that, reflecting the difficulties with the multilateral system, really from the design and the creation of the WTO. Yeah, but I think also the challenges that the US is experiencing in the WTO, in the growing strength of the African group, for instance, also demonstrates that something can be done. But of course, this is an open discussion with pros and cons in all this. Do we have any response from someone else? A question or comment? Don't have any other comment. So now in this case, I would go back to Jen before we wrap it up with all participants. We see that CSOs have an important role, and over the years we've seen the positive effects, impacts of CSOs.
Martin, there's a hand. There's a hand, Martin.
Sorry.
You need to choose for somebody.
Yes. Yes, I see. Joto Georgia, please. Yeah, please. The floor is open to you. cannot hear you. Yeah, you're unmuted now. You can speak. Can you hear us? But because we cannot hear you. As we try to reorganize, we have the issue of the role of civil society in promoting a trade that works for the people and that promotes development, that promotes inclusion, that promotes equity. So I'd like Jane to talk a little bit more on what she thinks at this point with the emergence of all these issues, the trade war, and the emerging use of all these tools for trade policy. What she thinks should be the role of the civil society in promoting further engagement, but in ensuring that we keep focus on the main need to ensure that trade works for the people. So Jen, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you so much, Martin. The role of the civil society. And first of all, I would like to applaud the civil society. They have been there in the trenches at all levels, at national, in fact, community level, national, regional, continental, and at global level. We have had a number of fights, Seattle, Cancun, So I think the role of civil society, especially during these turbulent times, I think we need to reclaim the narrative and challenge the dominant discourse. The discourse, in fact, that's the discourse where they tell us, those externally imposed ideas, narratives, and models. That is private sector led, liberalized, don't do that, So we need to challenge those models, those narratives, and we need to come up with our own ideology. Because you see, when we talk about, for example, a structural transformation, what does it look like? What about the policies? Vahin has talked about the trade policies, investments. He talked about investment, performance requirements. In fact, when you look at our investment policies and frameworks, they can't lead us to structural transformation. We are just protecting investors who come in, they are given incentives, they do what they want, they go away, they take away everything. They don't provide decent jobs, no skills, no technology. So we need to rethink the kind of policies, economic policies that we need. We need to rethink a lot, rethink the models like GDP. Should it be an indicator of development? What kind of development indicators should we put in place? So for me, I think it's the role of civil society to be able to do this rethink, to be able to put alternatives on the table, alternatives that anchor us, when we are negotiating. I'll give you an example. When we talk about, agricultural policies, agroecology, what does it mean? When we talk about seeds, Kenya has passed a law to criminalize seed saving. Is that structural transformation? Is that, are we promoting food security, food sovereignty on the continent? When it comes to industrialization, do we want to look at industrial parks, EPZs? So I think the role of civil society is to be able to negotiate, to help in the negotiations, but it's also the ideological anchor of our policies, anchored in social justice, anchored in the needs of our people. People as small-scale producers, people as workers, you know. So we need to be able to do that. And I think also, Edgar, you raised the issue of why they're kicking away that ladder. There is also a very good book by Eric Reinhardt, Why Rich Countries Stay Rich and Why Poor Countries Stay Poor, you know. And what Professor Eric Reinhardt is saying is that we do what they say. We don't do what they do or what they did, you know. They impose tariffs, they protect, they tell us liberalize, and we open up, you know. So that's a very good book to read by Eric Reinhardt. Lastly, I will leave you with some few, the litmus test by Mkapa, Benjamin Mkapa. He was the president, late president of Tanzania. When we are negotiating the EPAs, the Economic Partnership Agreements with the EU, and he said, you know, in order to judge whether that agreement is good or not, you can ask a number of questions. One, will that agreement help Africa increase their productive capacity? Will it encourage diversification and food security? Will it provide quality employment? Will it help us to move away from raw material export dependence to industrialized exports? And we were saying if the answer is yes to all these questions, then go ahead and sign that agreement. And these questions can apply to all the trade policies we have, to all these AGOAs, to the EBAs, and we can be able to assess whether they are fit for purpose or not. But lastly, I think for Africa and civil society, we need to be able to fight and see that Africa, we are together. We have a unit of purpose, and we are deliberate in our response to the current trade dynamics, and we are strategic, you know. Unlike the way we are doing, each one of us on our own, we put strategies in place. Lagos plan of action is there, not implemented. CFTA is there, not implemented. So I think we need to ensure that our continent really puts up its socks, and we are deliberate, and we are strategic. I think I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jay, for expounding the role of civil society. I will now give a moment to Edgar to give us his final reflection before I call upon Bahim to give us our closing remarks and get to wrap it up.
I think for me, the WTO paralysis and the current chaos in the global order is actually an opportunity for us to reassess the kind of policies we want to implement at the local level. Because for me, it represents, the Chinese saying, they say, danger represents an opportunity and threat. So we need to look at this global chaos as an opportunity to sit down and do serious strategic national interest, national and regional interest, but I mean Africa. It's an opportunity to do serious soul searching and basically policy leverage to be able to do things without consequences necessarily at the global level. Because the appellate body is not working and to be able to appeal to the void. If we take advantage of this moment, it can be a very good springboard for Africa to reassess and to basically rework the ACFTA, make sure it works for the continent. And for me, chaos is a good thing. It depends on how you use it. So that's what I'll leave you with. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Edgar, for that. And I call upon Bahimi to give us our final reflection on this discussion.
Thank you so much. There's so much to say, but I agree with Edgar. I think there's opportunity, or that the chaos presents an opportunity, a lot of strategic opportunities actually, in terms of kind of reclaiming industrial policy, allowed by the ruling. But also to say that, I think there's a huge opportunity here for diversifying partnerships. And this is not only in terms of South-South partnerships and cooperation, but also I think we shouldn't be too afraid of a retreat from the US. I think it's causing a lot of panic, and a lot of countries are very worried, and naturally so. But I think, there is an opportunity, and we should also be looking at how we can strengthen different kinds of partnerships, like regional and South-South frameworks. I mean, South-South trade had increased, I think, from 15% of global trade in 2005 to 24% in 2023. And even though there was a bit of a hiccup, it did actually retract a bit. I mean, it did reach up to 5.7 trillion in 2023. And I think overall this reflects a growing independence from traditional northern markets and the ability of developing countries to forge stronger trade ties on their own terms. And just another point, Edgar had made this point in his presentation about, focusing on critical raw materials and all of that. And I think one of the interesting cases or kind of examples coming out of China has been how they have been using CRM as a retaliatory measure in terms of the responses to the US tariff measures. And I think this also provides a deeper opportunity for African countries who are the owners of these raw materials, and Africa in particular, to be more assertive and to develop more stronger frameworks and stronger agreements and pricing mechanisms and all of that for those things to kind of ensure that, there is some kind of development that is also taking place and that it is not purely only an extractive model. And I think just finally, generally I would say that I also share the deep skepticism that the WTO can do anything in these very difficult times. My biggest concern now is that we are heading to Cameroon for MC14. And the unfortunate thing is that, Africa, I think, as past history has shown us, that we are going to be put in a position where we must be seen to be amenable. We must be seen to be passive. We must be seen to be accepted. And I think it will be very, very fundamental to go to the MC14 with at least 2 to 3, big negotiated issues that could potentially yield some kind of outcome. Thank you so much. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Rahimi. We have had very interesting deliberation over this webinar, and I would like to thank everyone for joining. Thank you.
I'm so sorry, but there's a hand that's up.
Yes. Yes. Go to Toshe.
He's not been able to talk, so maybe he doesn't know.
Can you? Yes, he is now unmuted. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay, sorry. Big one. First of all, thank you. Thank you. Insightful thing that you did that learned so much from each speaker. I just have one little thing to make. The last point made by Andy, the need on the I think agreement should be timed out in terms of having an immediate. We fully support this approach. We think that we need the issue of WTO is beyond WTO. Is how do we perceive the economic system which should govern the world in terms of trading, in terms of building our trade and economic relationship with other countries. But when we talk about the position of Africa, what we're seeing presently, what we tend to unfortunately, we replicate that building our local is the economic or the trading system within the Africa. CFTA's agreement is to some extent advanced on this liberal approach, which does not provide sufficient policy base or doesn't have a big incentive in terms of building our industrial facilities and I think industries. Because when we enter into the Marrakesh Agreement, the assumption is that to trade you need to produce. But what is the level of production in most of the diversified countries? What's the link between the financing system and the industrial system in our countries? So we think the reflections or the thinking that which we need to have should also translate on how we push and we raise awareness domestically, the regions and sub-regions, various sub-regions of Africa. That's why there are more to have a approach. Africa cannot detach himself from the global trading system. But Africa needs a policy space, and the best way to have a policy space is to have a time-bound, most of time-bound agreements. If we had that in the past, we would not have been arguing 30 years later what is the state of play. I think we should have been renegotiating most of those agreements at the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your wonderful reflections, Dosha. Do we have any other person who would like to give a comment? I think now we don't have. So I would like to first of all start by thanking you before I make a summary. I will now summarize and then we'll close the webinar. I'll talk about the issues that came up in their broadest sense. One is we are still discussing the issue of multilateralism and its challenges for Africa and the need for Africa to strategize with the new developments we are seeing. A key point here is that the multilateral trading system has not been fair to African countries, but it has some elements that African countries can use to promote their interests. So how do we balance in this, and how do we engage in the multilateral system by taking advantage of this new development, especially the decoupling of the US and the opportunity that have been created by the non-functioning dispute assessment body in terms of the appellate body that cannot sit. So that means any case can be appealed into a vacuum. So this presents an opportunity for Africa. Another issue that came up is the need for us to look at the issue of industrial policy that has re-emerged. But it is important to recognize the fact that industrial policy has been mentioned by African countries for a long time. For all, from the creation of the WTO, the need to maintain the policy space for promoting industrialization in Africa has been mentioned. And the issue of using tariffs as a legitimate tool for raising revenue, but also for protecting impact industries, and for the broader sense of promoting structural transformation. That's always been the case for African countries, but now we see very countries that dismiss this argument, and America, upon which the WTO was built, upon whose leadership and interest the WTO was built, is now using the same policies that was dismissed. So the issue of taking away the ladder comes into play. But it just reinforces the fact that trade policy is a dynamic issue. And so this dynamism requires that policy space. Another issue is the need to review the existing proposals for agreements. And the existing agreements itself also at the multilateral level, but also the new countries that come to Africa to negotiate new agreements. To use a a yardstick that Madam Jane referred to, the litmus test that the late Gaba talked about. So to answer this basic question on whether the proposed agreement can promote Africa's development in terms of job creation, in terms of promoting productivity, in terms of promoting value addition, and others. So these questions remain key that we need to look in. The issue of diversification also came in during the webinar. Diversifying across the African markets, one, building on the opportunities that the AFCFTA creates, but also looking at ensuring that African countries can guard their minerals such that they are not taken advantage of. We see what is happening in China in terms of ban exploitation of rare minerals, and the broader aspect that African countries need to ask ourselves is, can we still pursue this liberalization agenda and develop, yet several countries that are already developed use protectionist measures, trade restrictive measures to develop, and these same countries are going back to those measures. So this is a key question that we need to look at. And also the fact that it is interesting that African countries are promoting, are engaged in trade negotiations to further liberalize when the current global dynamics with this new trade war and the realignment of the strategic objectives of the US and even the EU is pushing towards more restriction by introducing measures like the CEPA and the deforestation regulations that appear to be addressing climate change in this broader terms, but also undermining market access of African countries. We also had about the need to use the existing spaces we have to ensure that to facilitate the role of investment in promoting development, and to put performance requirements to link investments to the economies as promoting backward and forward linkages, and the whole issue of ensuring that our domestic policies are aligned to our objectives of promoting empowerment of communities, promoting production, of building resilience at the domestic level, but also of ensuring that trade works with the broader aspects of development. So aligning these domestic policies and strategies that Africa has, but also with the continental strategies, that in broader sense, because of the similarities in development needs, still talks about the similar issues that can be termed as structural transformation of Africa. How Africa needs to align this when engaging with the international trading partners, but also in line of the existing development we are seeing. So I would like to thank Siatin so much for organizing this webinar, which is one very informative, but also very timely. So Siatin, together with South Center, we applaud you for this excellent move to bring together these rich experts to discuss this very issue that is pertinent to the development of African countries. And we can only hope that this can become a yardstick to promote further collaborations and policy debates, and that African experts can be linked further with African experts, the civil societies, and several actors can be linked to deliberate on these issues and generate recommendations that can be used not only by the Tanzania and South Center, but the broader civil society movement in Africa to promote their development interests. So I thank you all, and I thank all of you participants for your actively following the webinar, and I'd like to wish you all a good evening or a good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.